There is a moment in every conversation when the space between words becomes more powerful than the words themselves. Most people have never noticed this moment. They fill it with noise, with interruption, with the desperate need to be heard. But there exists an ancient understanding, refined over centuries by warriors who understood that power is not measured in volume, but in the depth of what remains unspoken. This is the story of how silence became a weapon, and how learning to say nothing transformed everything. In the early 17th century, Miyamoto Musashi sat across from a younger swordsman during what would become a legendary duel. The accounts describe an unusual moment before their blades ever touched. Musashi, the undefeated master with over 60 victories, did not speak. He did not explain his technique. He did not warn his opponent. He simply observed. The younger man, desperate to prove himself, filled the silence with aggression, with movement, with noise. Within moments, it was over. Musashi had not moved unnecessarily. He had not wasted a single gesture or word. The silence between them had already decided the outcome. This principle extended far beyond combat. In Zen monasteries across Japan, silence was not a punishment or an absence. It was a practice. It was training for the mind. When a student asked a master a question, the master might sit in complete silence for an hour before responding with a single sentence. This was not rudeness. This was instruction. The silence taught the student that not every question deserved an immediate answer, that the value of speech lay not in its frequency, but in its precision. The samurai carried this practice into every aspect of their lives: in court, at the table, in negotiation, in teaching their children. The warrior who said less held more power than the one who spoke constantly. Chapter 1: The Noise. Consider Marcus, a corporate executive in the modern world who believed that his value was directly proportional to how much he spoke in meetings. He attended 5 meetings a day. He interrupted, he clarified, he offered opinions, he filled every silence with his perspective. By any external measure, he was successful. He had the title, the salary, the corner office. But internally, something was fractured. He was exhausted. His relationships with colleagues were surface level and transactional. Most importantly, he had lost the ability to think clearly. His mind had become a radio station that never turned off, broadcasting constantly, never listening. One evening, Marcus attended a lecture on Zen philosophy by someone who had spent years studying in Japanese monasteries. The speaker said something that lodged itself in his consciousness. In the beginning, you must learn to be silent so that you can learn to listen. Later, you learn to speak so that you can teach. But the master knows when to do neither. Marcus left the lecture disturbed. He recognized himself in the description of someone who had never progressed beyond the first stage. He was still fighting the silence, still afraid of it. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that seemed absurdly simple. In his first meeting, he would not speak unless directly asked. He would observe. He would listen. The first 10 minutes felt like an eternity. His mind screamed at him to contribute, to establish his presence, to remind everyone that he was important. But something deeper in him held firm. He noticed things he had never heard before. A junior analyst made a suggestion that was brilliant, but was immediately talked over by someone else. A colleague's tone revealed frustration that no one had addressed. The politics of the room became visible in the spaces between words. When Marcus finally spoke near the end of the meeting, something unexpected happened. Everyone stopped and listened. His single comment, which synthesized what others had been discussing for an hour, shifted the entire direction of the conversation. He had said less than he normally said in the first 5 minutes. He had accomplished more. Chapter 2: The Pattern. This was not accident. This was pattern. The samurai understood that speech follows a natural law, like water flowing downhill. When you speak constantly, your words lose weight. they become noise. Each word you add to the world decreases the value of every word you have already spoken. The warrior who speaks rarely, however, commands attention. A single sentence from him can alter the course of events because everyone knows that he has considered it carefully. His silence is not weakness, it is discipline. But there is something deeper happening beneath this surface observation. When you restrain your speech, you are not simply changing how others perceive you. You are transforming your internal life. The samurai meditation practice called zazen teaches this principle. In zazen, you sit in complete silence and stillness, watching your thoughts arise and pass away without commenting on them, without narrating them, without building stories around them. This practice fundamentally alters how your mind operates. Over time, you develop the ability to observe your own thoughts without being enslaved by them. You see the impulse to speak arise in your consciousness, and instead of automatically expressing it, you examine it first. You ask, is this true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Is this the right moment?
The ancient Zen masters called this practice of restraint mon, or purposeful silence. It was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had everything to say, but had learned when not to say it. This is a critical distinction. The person who is silent because they are afraid or stupid is not practicing the samurai way. The person who is silent because they have trained their mind to distinguish between impulse and wisdom, this person has found a source of power that most people never locate. Marcus began to see this distinction clearly in his own life. He noticed that most of his habitual speaking came from anxiety, not wisdom. He would speak to fill silence because silence made him uncomfortable. He would speak to establish dominance because he feared losing status. He would speak to prove he was intelligent because he doubted his own worth. None of these impulses came from clarity. They all came from fear. When he stopped speaking automatically, he had to face these fears directly, and in facing them, something began to shift. Chapter 3. The Discipline. The samurai path has always been a path of discipline, but this discipline is often misunderstood. In the West, we think of discipline as the ability to do difficult things through willpower and force. The samurai understood discipline differently. Shu Ha Ri describes the 3 stages of mastery. First, you protect and learn the fundamentals. Second, you break and innovate within the framework. Third, you transcend and walk your own way. At each stage, discipline means something different. But discipline with speech means one thing consistently. You must become aware of the automatic impulses that drive your mouth to move, and you must create space between the impulse and the action. This space is everything. In Japanese martial arts, this space is called ma. It is the emptiness, the silence, the pause between movements. A skilled swordsman does not fill every moment with sword strikes. The moments of stillness are where the next movement is being prepared. The opponent cannot read the strike that has not yet been committed to. Similarly, in speech, the moments of silence are where your next words are being refined. They are where you determine if they are worth speaking at all. Marcus began a simple practice. Every time he felt the impulse to speak, he would pause for one full breath before deciding whether to speak. One breath, nothing more. This single discipline transformed everything. In that one breath, something remarkable happened. Most of the words he wanted to say simply disappeared. They were not worth speaking. They were reactions, not responses. They were performances, not communications. By the time his breath was complete, he had usually recognized this and remained silent. When he did speak, after that one breath pause, his words were different. They were clearer. They were more direct. They carried weight.
Weeks passed. Marcus stopped attending social gatherings where all he did was talk.
He stopped the constant background stream of commentary in his mind. He started reading books that required sustained attention. He started listening to people, really listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. Something inside him quieted. The desperate quality of his presence began to dissolve. He was no longer fighting the silence. He was beginning to understand it. Chapter 4. The Transformation. There is a Zen teaching that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But this teaching is often misunderstood as something mystical, something that happens to you. The samurai understood that the teacher only appears when you have created the internal conditions to learn from them. Marcus had created those conditions through silence. Now, insights began to arrive that had always been present, but had been drowned out by his own noise.
He noticed that the people he most respected rarely spoke. A senior executive in his company, someone he had always assumed was quiet because he lacked confidence, turned out to be quiet because he was deeply observant. This man could read a room in seconds. He could understand another person's unstated concerns just by watching their body language. He could navigate complex political situations with a single well-placed comment because he had spent years listening rather than talking. Marcus realized that what he had mistaken for weakness was actually the highest form of strength. He also began to understand why silence had been so central to the samurai code. The warrior who speaks is revealing strategy, emotion, and vulnerability. The warrior who is silent reveals nothing. In a context where your life depends on maintaining advantage, where one mistake in communication could cost you everything, silence becomes not a virtue but a necessity. The samurai were not silent because they were enlightened. They were silent because silence was the most practical response to the conditions of their lives. But in learning to be silent for practical reasons, they discovered something unexpected. The silence itself changed them. It made them more aware, more intelligent, more present.
Marcus experienced this transformation in smaller ways, but the principle was identical. By learning to be silent in meetings, he became more aware of group dynamics, of unstated conflicts, of opportunities that others were missing. By learning to listen rather than speak, he gathered better information. By creating space between impulse and action, he made better decisions. The silence was not something external that he had learned to tolerate. It had become internal. It had become part of how his mind now worked. Chapter 5. The Mastery. After several months of this practice, something unexpected happened. Marcus attended a board meeting where a major decision needed to be made. The room was full of intelligent, accomplished people, all speaking, all defending their positions. The conversation went in circles for an hour. Then, Marcus spoke. He had been silent the entire meeting until that moment. He had listened to every argument. He had watched the unspoken alliances and fears. When he finally spoke, he did not advocate for a position. He simply reflected back what he had heard, identified the actual disagreement beneath the surface argument, and suggested a framework for thinking about the problem that transcended the current deadlock. The room went silent. Then, gradually, people began to build on what he had said. Within 20 minutes, a genuine consensus had emerged. It was not his consensus, it was the group's consensus, revealed through his clarity. But because he had spoken so rarely and with such precision, his words had served as a mirror rather than as an assertion of ego. This is the ultimate mastery of silence. It is not about being passive or weak. It is about understanding that power often flows through the spaces you create, not through the noise you generate. The samurai understood that the most dangerous warrior was not the one who spoke about his skill. It was the one whose skill spoke for itself, because he had trained so thoroughly that unnecessary words were irrelevant. Marcus realized that he had passed through a threshold. He was no longer practicing silence consciously. Silence had become his natural state. He spoke when speech was necessary, but he no longer felt the anxiety that had driven his constant talking. He no longer needed to prove himself through words. This was not arrogance, it was the opposite of arrogance. It was a clarity that came from having released the desperate need to be noticed, to be heard, to be validated through the constant assertion of his own importance. Chapter 6: The Return. The final stage of mastery, according to the samurai path, is the return to the world. Once you have learned to be silent, once you have discovered the power in restraint, you must learn when to break that silence. The master does not remain silent forever. That would be its own form of evasion. Rather, the master speaks with such precision and clarity that every word carries weight. Silence is no longer a discipline he practices. It is simply the baseline from which he operates.
Marcus returned to his life with this understanding. He did not become someone who never spoke. He became someone who spoke only when he had something genuine to offer. His meetings became shorter and more effective. His relationships became deeper because he actually listened to people instead of waiting for his turn to talk. His own thinking became clearer because he spent less time defending positions and more time examining them. Most importantly, he discovered something that the samurai have known for centuries. When you stop needing to be heard, you become worth listening to. There is a final teaching from the Zen tradition that applies here. A student asked a master, "Why do you never speak?" The master replied, "I speak constantly. The silence is simply louder." What this means is that once you have truly learned the discipline of silence, you understand that presence itself is a form of communication. The way you listen, the quality of your attention, the clarity in your eyes, these all speak before you ever open your mouth. And when you do speak, after having been silent, your words land differently. They are no longer noise competing for space in a crowded room. They are signal cutting through the noise.
In a world that rewards constant visibility, constant output, constant assertion of self, the samurai principle of silence offers an alternative. It offers the possibility that you might become more powerful by saying less, more present by doing less, more successful by releasing the desperate need to prove yourself through endless noise. This is not a passive path. It is the most difficult discipline there is because it requires you to face the anxieties that drive your constant speaking. But on the other side of that discipline lies a clarity and a power that most people spend their entire lives chasing through the opposite direction, through more noise, more assertion, more desperate attempts to be heard. The silence between breaths is where mastery lives, not in the words, but in what lies between them, not in the action, but in the stillness from which true action emerges. This is the lesson that Musashi carried into every duel. This is the practice that transformed the samurai into something legendary. And it is available to you right now, in the next conversation you have, in the next moment when the impulse to speak arises. You have the choice. You can fill the silence, or you can let it deepen you.